we're ready to start. We have now 71 people, so we can start with the entry. So the room is all yours, Matthew. Let me just resume the share. And there you go. All yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Analytics Network autumn event. We're obviously very much in a virtual world at the moment, so those of you who joined a little bit early will know that we're interested in where people are, and we've had a wide variety of places, quite a lot in the UK as you might expect, but also welcome to people from Madrid, Oklahoma. You are more than welcome to come along. So the Analytics Network is a branch of the Operational Research Society, or a group within that, the Operational Research Society, and the aim of the Analytics Network is to increase awareness, get discussions going, understand what people are doing in the world of analytics. There is obviously big overlap between what might be called traditional operational research and the very much the new area of analytics, working with data, understanding what data can be used for. So the Analytics Network was set up by the Operational Research Society as an outlet really for people to come together, understand what is happening in the world of analytics and sharing ideas. Historically, we have had events, physical events, where obviously the networking on occasions is slightly easier, but obviously we would encourage you to use the chat within the Zoom. So for those of you who may not be that familiar with Zoom, although I think most people are now, given where we are or the status we're in at the moment, there is a little icon down the bottom called chat. Please do address your comments to everyone, and then obviously we can make sure that we're sharing ideas. If you do have any questions during the talks this evening, please do put them in the chat. We will be allowing time after each of the speeches this evening for questions. So please do pose your questions. If we get a chance, we'll actually allow you to ask them yourself, but obviously what we're trying to do is get as many questions in there as possible. Just in case you did join just before we started, I do have to make you aware that the session is being recorded. So consequently, if you object to being recorded, now is your opportunity to leave. Obviously, we hope we don't, but we do understand that some people may not be happy with being recorded. You'll see there a few logistics in terms of all participants will be muted by the Zoom master, so the person running the meeting, and we do ask that you also mute your video as well, just so that in terms of helping us through. I mentioned already about the Q&A and also that the event is being recorded as well. So any question and answers, please do use questions, please do use the chat, or even any comments. I know both of the speakers will be interested to hear comments as well as questions, and we'll obviously summarize those and make sure that those are distributed out to everybody afterwards. So some of you have been putting in where you are at the moment. A massive advantage of going virtual is that people can be anywhere, and even just looking at the last few entries in the chat, we've got people joining from London, Ankara, Malton and Dusseldorf. So welcome everybody, and welcome to this Analytics Network event. So just before we actually start with the two speeches this evening, we have a couple of questions which just help us in terms of planning future events and understanding who is actually attending these events. So I believe Eduardo, as Zoom master, is going to just pose a couple of questions. So the first question you'll see on the screen now, if this is the first time is this your first time, attending an event from the Analytics Network or the Operational Research Society? So if you could just select one of those, please, that would be much appreciated. Okay, we're still waiting just for a couple more people to respond back to that. Okay, I believe we may have most of the responses in there. I know not everybody has answered, but I think we've got most of them there. And interestingly, it's almost a 50-50 split. 55% saying this is your first event, so welcome. We will be telling you about future events at the end, but 45% have been to other events. So again, welcome to those people who have come again. So the next question, and say after this question, we will be going on to very much talking about the speeches this evening. What best describes your current role? Are you in academia? Are you what you describe as an analytics professional, or other? The general catch-all of other, i.e. not in analytics directly. You may be retired, for example. Okay, and I think we've got most of the answers in for that. And interestingly, a slight majority, not majority, sorry, more people slightly in the analytics professional on this. So again, that's very encouraging, and thank you for that. And the final question, which I know some of you have answered already, so the final question in the poll, some of you have answered it in the chat just as we were starting, is can you just put in where you are? And again, it just helps us in terms of making sure we're pitching this. So if you haven't put this into the chat, could you actually just put in where you are based or where you're listening to this event in the chat, please? It just helps us organise them. So thank you very much for that. And yes, we're seeing them coming through now. So quite a few from London, Loughborough, Brighton, London, Sheffield. Sheffield is very popular this evening, we discovered. So welcome, everybody. So on to the main element of this evening. We have two excellent speakers for you lined up, Valeria and Paul. And I will introduce them and then obviously allow the speakers to give their presentations, and then there will be a little bit of time for questions after that. Again, just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please do put them in the chat and we'll try and get as many of those answered as we can. So there will be opportunity for questions after each of the speeches, and then depending what time it is, possibly time for questions at the end. And then obviously we'll just finish off by telling you about the next event coming up. So Valeria and Paul are our two speakers this evening. First is Valeria, and she's a senior data scientist in the borrowing team at Monzo. And her work is focusing very much on building credit models and analysis to provide the best borrowing options to customers. So previously, she has worked on the development of machine learning solutions for different business areas of the Lloyds Banking Group. And during this time, she focused on building tools and processes to detect and mitigate bias in machine learning models. So Valeria is a strong advocate of ethics and responsibility in AI, as well as bringing more diversity into technical teams. So with her speech, presentation of bias, discrimination and fairness in classification models, please welcome Valeria.
Wonderful, thank you for the intro, Matthew. I'm not gonna start sharing my screen, and let me know if you can see this.
Yeah, we can see now the screen. Yeah.
Wonderful. So let me present now. Great. So hi everyone. As Matthew mentioned before, I'm a data scientist at Monzo, and today I wanted to present you a lot of content that I've been learning throughout the past years as working as data scientist, and things I've been able to implement on my previous role at Lloyds, and now things that I'm also working on at Monzo. So our agenda for today is first to learn some sources of discrimination. We're going to touch a lot of different examples to understand where discrimination in automated systems come from. Then I'm going to provide you with a classification example of how we basically classify whether we should be providing a loan or not to you, or whether we should basically doing some risk assessment. and the kind of model that we normally use in order to automate certain solutions. With that example, we're going to go through different classification metrics in part 3, and then we're going to provide an example of how everything comes together, followed by some conclusions. So let's start with the first part. So where does discrimination come from? I think a big part of discrimination is actually on the data. As human beings, we're the ones who actually source how we see the view in terms of data. And we can be very subjective in the way that we create it, and we can have also a lot of blind spots. So it's very important to understand what kind of data we're using that can have a huge impact on automated decisions that we deploy in society. As you see here, there are a lot of different examples, and we're going to touch each single one of them with a specific example. So when we talk about bias data, one of the big things is actually a bias target. We call a target in machine learning something that you're trying to predict. For instance, Amazon was trying to predict who they should be hiring as software engineer. As you might imagine, this is super subjective because they need to define who they consider a good software engineer in order to build that target function. What actually happened here is that the model never really liked employing women. It just would go through all the CVs, but it would never really want to detect any women or consider any woman. Why is that? Well, reality is that they use a sample where here now we're talking about representation. There were very, very few women. And possibly the very few women that were in the sample were quite unique compared to the men that could be more generalizable. What happened at the end is that the model learned too much from men. And because each single woman was so distinct, it could never really pick up women as good candidates for software engineers. Why does this happen? When we create a CV, there's still a lot of different styles between women and men. We might use different language, which the model probably used. We might have different characteristics, such as hobbies, subjects that we take, and so on. And this is a big problem because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we change the status quo and that we do a more representable hiring. We go to the next one. The next one is one that I found like extremely big problem, and that is machine learning for law enforcement. There was this company called Compass that were trying to model the likelihood of reoffense in the US. So what could go wrong here? We have, again, a very biased target, because if we look into the people that were decided to send to jail, it is super biased. We know that for sure because there's a lot of bias against certain groups in society, in particular against the Latino and Black community. We also know that there's different kind of representation. We might perceive certain groups more risky than others, and that creates this feedback loop whereby people end up being assessed always as riskier because the machine learning model just learns from the same thing. What happened is that Republican, a nonprofit organization, looked a bit closer on how these people were actually being scored by Compass. And what we could see here is that there are two types of errors. One is that you're very risky, but the model says you're not risky. And there's the other type of error that you really want to avoid, when you're actually not risky, but the model thinks you're very risky. So you want to be in the first kind of error, where the model tells you you're not risky despite being actually risky. Risky in the sense of reoffending soon. What happened is that when they looked at a wide population, they were way more likely to be marked as not risky when they were in fact very likely to reoffend. And this was the opposite for the African American community. So what we can say here is that we have a disproportionate result against the African American community because they're being marked as very likely to reoffend when they're actually not. And the opposite is for the white people, which is actually a preferable outcome. So this is how we start thinking about discrimination and disproportionate outcome in machine learning. Now, this is another part that I wanted to show you. This is about representation. Why do we think that white people were marked as more likely to reoffend when they were actually, why do we think that white people are not risky when in fact they are? And what might have happened is that in the sample, as we see here, the risk score of white offenders was much more biased towards the lower scores, so less likely to reoffend. And that creates a bias towards trying to make white people less risky. And this happens through proxies in the models and other ways that you can actually detect race, even if you don't have race in your own model. Now I wanted to mention another example, which is extremely important as you build samples. This is missing and wrong data. So if you think about the US, there are 30% of consumers in low income that are credit invisible. That means that the most vulnerable people we don't have data from. And without data, we cannot score them properly, which means is that they're possibly like financially invisible, and they cannot access to financial services that should be meant for everyone. In my case, this was also the same in the UK. As you will notice from my last names, I have 3 basically. And one of the poor scores was not picking up my last names correctly, which meant that I was financially exclusive. So I could not access certain financial services such as a credit card. And the reason being is that because the bureau could not connect all my data. And despite being in this country for many years, I could not access to essential services. And that to me is discrimination or unfair treatment. Now we're going to be talking more about what is a classification model in order to better understand how we can potentially understand fairness. So this is, let's have a look at this graph. So here, let's say we have each dot is a person and we're looking at their income. And we want to build a classification model where we say, based on the data, we want to classify people as likely to pay or likely not to pay. And based on that, in the future, we're going to decide whether they will get a loan or not. So the ones that are in blue, those are people that have repaid in the past, and the ones that are in gray, those are the people that have defaulted. So what we do in machine learning is that we use some sort of statistical method or some sort of even rule system where we want to create a probability. And based on that, we're going to have a cutoff. So before we had income, let's just normalize this, and that's going to be our model for this example. So we're going to say that based on income, we're just going to decide whether people should get a loan or not. All the people that are below the threshold that we're setting are the ones that we're going to say people that have a probability below a certain amount based on the income, we're going to deny them a loan. We're going to deny the loan. And all the people that are above this cutoff, we're going to say we're going to provide them a loan. We're going to grant them one. So now, oops, there we go. So if we look now at all the people that we're actually granting a loan, we have people that we call true positives. Those are the people that we are deciding to provide a loan, and they've also paid in the past, so that is good. And we have people that we're granting a loan, but they have not paid back in the past. So this is called a false positive. Somebody that is actually risky, but we are allowing to grant a loan. And this is the kind of errors we want to avoid. Why I'm telling you this, it will all make sense when we look into the fairness metrics. So now defining fairness. How do we actually do it at the moment? We basically do nothing. I mean, it's not that we do nothing. It is quite common not to do nothing. And this is called fairness through unawareness. You build a model, you don't mind who are the people in your data set or the people that are going to be affected by your model, and you just launch it. You don't think about the consequences, and you just launch a model. If you think about it, when we launch models about, well, not us, anyone outside launch models about ads or recommendation system, it's quite normal not to think about how this can have a disproportionate impact in society. But even on ads, there was another case, for instance, where there were, through Google platform, there were being some ads recommended for professionals training, I think. And this was way more often being targeted at men than women because of the way they have constructed it. And this is not fair, because then we might provide certain services more towards a specific group of society rather than others. So it is always important to keep this in mind. And also, let's give now an example. Let's say we're now building a model. We're doing a classification model here again. And what we want to know is who should we hire as a CEO in the next company? And we have data on age, income, education, and numbers of sales. So who might be that person? It might be this man. He is an electrical engineer from Oxford University with many cells. And what happens is that the model will look into these attributes and it's going to find a lot of proxies towards that are very biased towards white men at a certain age group because that's what it's seen in the past. And it's very unlikely to pick up somebody with new characteristics. If you think about it, this is not great because as we progress in the world, we want to make sure we change the status quo. However, models learn from the past. And that is something to remember. If you want to change the future, we cannot simply use data from the past. Now, here we go now to our first measure of fairness. This is the one called demographic parity. With demographic parity, we want to make sure that whatever reward we're giving, it's actually proportional the same based on different groups. So here, group A and B could be something like, let's say, female and male. And what we're looking into in demographic parity is that they can access whatever we're offering at the same rate. If we look at group A, we have 8 people, and based on that cutoff, we're going to be providing the loan, in this case, to 4 people. That means that 50% are going to be receiving the loan. When we look at group B, we have 2 out of 4, which is also 50%. So if this would be our model and our result, we would say that we match demographic parity. We have demographic parity in our model results. And that is like saying we classify everyone as repay divided by everyone, or if you're familiar with a confusion matrix, which is very common in machine learning, then that would be like saying all the positives, this is basically all the people that will be getting your loan per group, divided by everyone else. And this is where the 50% come from. Now, when do we actually use this? I think universities is a good example. Let's assume universities are building a model to hire students or to accept students. We want to make sure that we're changing the state of our world because we are aware that as we are now, we're providing more, we're accepting more people from specific backgrounds that usually have more privilege. But we also want to make sure that we accept people who have not had yet the same opportunities, but they could make it there, they could get there. And we want to make sure that once we accept this group of people, we also provide the right support for them to be at the same level as their counterparts. If we look at the University of Oxford, this is something they've sort of done, not at a model level, but just at a normal acceptance, the way that they accept people. They've identified groups of people that come from an unprivileged background, and they know that maybe they're not at the same level as their other counterparts, but they want to make sure that they're giving like a new year in order to receive more reinforcement in the learning to match the level of education they're required in order to start university. And this is a good way of doing demographic parity, where you are doing some positive discrimination, but at the same time, we're providing the right support so that it doesn't have any counter effect. Now let's look at another question. So let's say we're again building a model, but this time we're actually going to be having a dancing crew. Our subjects are singers, dancers, and actors. And my own personal bias is that singers or dancers, I'm pretty sure they're going to be able to do a good job. However, actors, because of the lack of experience and the way that they do their work, it's very unlikely. What could happen? It could happen something like this, where I'm only reinforcing my own bias because I see a bad actor dancing. And that is because also very few actors actually, they might have been in my sample. So let's look into what could we do. This is another metric called now equal opportunity. So this is a second metric that I'm now showing you. The very big difference with the one before is that here what we want to do is to only allow the people that actually qualify for it. So before, if you remember, we were saying like across everyone who we accept divided by all the people. Here we're saying just show me the people who actually get the loan and have repaid back. So instead of looking at all of the ones above the cutoff, we're actually going to be looking at 2, the ones that have repaid back in the past. So here we have 2 out of 4 people who actually paid back. And in group B, we have 1 out of 2. What this is saying is that we want to make sure we classify everyone who repaid divided by who repaid and it makes it, divided by everyone who's repaid in the past. So in both cases, we have 50%. That means that we say, okay, we have here equal opportunity. Thinking about classification confusion metrics, we're saying that our true positives, again, the ones on the top that actually fulfill the requirements, is divided by all the positives, so that we can also take into account, out of those who paid back, what percentage do we get right. Now, this is also like saying in a way like fair dancing, but only if you can dance. However, we still have some issues. Let's look at this. So we're looking now at group A and B, and we see that the equal opportunities is in both cases 75%. However, we can see that all the dark greens, these are the people that can really dance. So these are drag that fulfill the requirement. However, in group B, we see a lot of people who are not fantastic, which means that if we actually use this metric and set a single threshold, we might allow way too many people who are actually not good at their job. And that can create reinforcement bias. So we need to do something better. And for that, but before I continue, when do we actually use this metric? When does it actually make sense? I think this is a good case when we only care about the positives, so the people that we're trying to properly detect. Fraud detection, it can be a good case. For instance, let's say we want to detect as much fraud, but as part of that, we might allow other groups having a lot of like false positives, in the sense that we're calling you and telling you, oh, there's fraud in your card, but it's actually not. So we don't think that has a negative impact in society. And if disproportionately one group receives more calls from the back saying we think there's something wrong with your card, it's not that bad, because we also know we're trying to maximize the card frauds. We're trying to maximize the transactions that might be fraudulent. So this could be a good example when we use equal opportunity. Now, this is, I promise, the final metric. This is called equalized odds. And this is something that we normally look when I look into credit risk. So equalized odds is the same as equal opportunity, but with a big difference that we don't only look at the people who repaid, but we also looked at the people who did not and look at the mistakes around it. So the first requirement is exactly as the one before, where we see, okay, 2 out of 4, 2 people who repaid back, divided of 4 who paid back in the past. But we also look into the equal false positive rate, which means is that out of the people that defaulted, these 4 here, how many of them are we misclassifying? And that is 1 out of 4, which is 25%. We go here and we see, okay, out of the people who did not pay, what percentage are we misclassifying because we're saying it would pay, or that we're saying like it's not risky? And that is 25%. So we're now saying in this example, we're matching equalized odds because all the metrics are correct. And this is something that you can use when you care about set a very good job at predicting, at looking at those who will be repaying back, but also making sure that you're not accepting people who should not be there. And this is, again, saying like predicting equally well those who repay and making equal rate of mistakes across those who will default. When does this make sense to use it? I think credit models is a very important, it's a very good example, because if we think about, we want to make sure that we are providing as many loans as we can to people who can repay, but we also don't want to make, we want to be responsible and not grant loans to people who cannot repay, because we're going to put them into debt, we're going to ruin the schools, and it's also not financially good for the bank. So before I continue to the case study, Eduardo, are there any questions, or Matthew, are there any questions I should be answering now, or should we leave them for the end?
It's Matthew. I think that there is a question and a comment in the chat, but what we'll probably do is leave them to the end, because I think the fairly general questions related to the whole presentation. So perhaps we'll leave them till the end.
Perfect, wonderful. So I'm now going to go take you through an external case study. This is not Monzo related. This is something that where I use a public data set while I was at university and did like a small case study. What I wanted to do here is that I was building a model in order to detect whether people would repay back their loan or not. So I just built a tree-based model, and I looked into how does my model perform with people who are older or younger than 40 years old. And I wanted to see where there was any difference. What I did here was to first build a ROC curve. So if you've ever built a model, what you always look into is how well does your model perform? As you saw before, we can always set like different thresholds based on our probability. And based on that, you start plotting the points around here. And the closer it is to this edge, the better that your model is. And when we look into different segments, we want to make sure that it is very similar, very similar across the different segments. As we see here, between my two age groups, it was not very different. So I thought the model seems to work fairly well for both age groups. So nothing to be concerned about. However, I was then being when we were talking about equal opportunity, equalized odds, or demographic parity, we can say we want it to be exactly the same or have a bit of like a buffer where we say it must be something like no more than 2 percentage points difference. So that's something I did here. I wanted to make sure that I'm looking into equal opportunity, demographic parity, and equalized odds. And I wanted to see that if I put these restrictions, how would my revenue be affected? So I put an example where if you get a loan, you get, let's say, £1. If you do a misclassification, then you subtract 2. And what we could see is that for equal opportunity demographic parity, revenue remained about the same in this example. But when we use the equalized odds, which is a bit more restrictive because you look into the positives and also negatives, then it dropped quite a bit. And this is something where you need to play around a bit in order to make sure you have a good model at the end. And then we're now coming to the conclusions. So key takeaways. We cannot really make a model unfair, but we can collect better data. So if you see that your model is really wrong through one of the metrics that we showed, we really need to reconsider what is the right data that we should be collecting, or where can we get that data from in order to make a better model. Then we can always measure how unfair a model is. That might be, for instance, an example where our target is super biased, such as hiring. But we can also always have a lot of input from our side in order to try to make it as objective as possible. Then we can assess an unfair model if we don't collect information on protected classes. And this is extremely important because in many places we don't have data about race, we don't have data about gender, and without these data points, there's no way for ourselves to audit our own models. And without that, we don't know what the consequences are before we deploy the model. Having said that, that's the final points, and I'm going to start taking all your questions.
Thank you very much, Valeria. So a couple of questions which come up. The first one, I think it's George who posed this question, and he's saying, where in the deployed decision pipeline are you considering GDPR considerations, particularly the aspect about rights related to automated decision making and profiling? So I don't know whether you would like to respond to that then, please, Valeria.
I'm afraid I'm very unfamiliar with that questions and also in terms of GDPR. So there is certainly a process in place, but I don't interact closely to it, I'm afraid. So I'm afraid we'll have to skip that one, or if you can contact me personally, I can try to find out where that takes place at Monzo.
Okay. Another question from Mike. Stam, could we remove bias by eliminating the features that cause that bias?
That's an interesting one. So there are at times, something that is really interesting is to look at correlations, but you need to, it will depend a lot on the business problem, because it would be very normal to use income, for instance, in a credit model, right? Because you want to know how much the person is earning so that you can match towards to do your risk assessment. However, it's also very correlated with gender. So I think in that case, it is important because it's okay because we know that it's predictive, and it's not something like using Hotmail or Gmail. On the other hand, when you look at equalized odds, which would be like the right metric of fairness to use, it would be doing the right thing on looking at the true positives and also at the false positives. So that would be okay. There might be cases where this was a research paper that I read where it said it is okay to be correlated as we know there has some sort of causation. I mean, it's something like quite very well studied in the past. But let's say Gmail and Hotmail as accounts are correlated with gender. That's not something you want to add to your model. So that question is like, it depends. It depends on the business problem and how predictive we really know that is and how stable we really think that variable is.
Okay. And there's actually been a follow-up in terms of the GDPR, but it's not directly related to GDPR. And it's how do you measure the rate of false negatives if you don't risk it? So to add a little bit more to that, this is for a Monzo question, I suppose, and obviously appreciate you may want to respect company confidentiality. Do you allocate an extra budget to actually offer loans to people who normally wouldn't qualify? And the person asking this, I think it's George again, the experience in microloans in India demonstrated that people who would normally not be trusted, if you did trust them, they actually repay even more than the average, so that they default less often. So I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, Valeria.
Our portfolio is quite small, so we don't have too much room for experimentation at this point. And it's also heavily regulated. So yeah, experimentation is not much of an option, especially us as a small bank. However, in other places where you need to experiment to get more data, it might be a way to start. In the case of India, I guess also because of the loan size being much smaller, you have more space to experiment. And I guess it's more like a tactic of how to collect more data, which might be necessary in that case. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we'll have one more question and then a comment from somebody, and then so a question on how you remove bias in practice. So the question is, are you making adjustments to the model parameters or adjusting the cutoffs for different subgroups, or another approach? In other words, you build a model to work out who to offer reward to, but you may say that young people are much more likely to churn.
On the first,
they're not related. Sorry, the first question.
Sorry. On the first one, whether you do something on the model, I've talked to a few academics in the area, and they think that there's very little you can do on the model. I mean, even if there's some optimization techniques you can do, if your data is biased, it's really hard to work around it. What you need to really do is it's quite of an analytical work. Once you have your sample data set, you need to be proactively thinking of where we can have blind spots. So if we look at missing data, where do we think those missing data are more common from? If we detect that, one way of mitigating that is actually segmentation, where you build a model for a specific group of people and a model for other group of people. And it can be done in different ways in order to create a model that is more suitable for those specific characteristics. So that's one technique that you can actually use. I don't think you can unbias a data set, but you can build a model that's more suitable for certain groups. That might also include using different characteristics, because each model will pick up different variables. So that if you have a group of people where data is very limited digitally, you might find other ways to include it. So different models might be suitable for different samples.
Okay, thank you. And there are a couple more questions coming, but in the interest of time, I'll just, a comment was made, which I'll tell you in a moment, and then we'll move on. And depending how time goes, we may have time at the end for questions. What we will do, just for everybody's benefit on the call, we'll make sure that both Valeria and Paul get a copy of all of the questions that have been asked. And then if necessary, any follow-ups could happen. But just to finish off Valeria's session, it's a comment from John, and this relates back to one of the very first aspects you talked about, Valeria. And his comment was, I have worked with some very good software developers and taught many very good students who happen to be women. I would expect somebody who arrogantly overestimated their ability to do this work to be male. And I didn't know whether you wanted to comment on that at all, Valeria.
I've been very lucky that I've been in environments where this work has been important for male and females. But I did meet one male that he thought it was not necessary. We have our one of the MPs, right, who doesn't want to do training on bias, on unconscious bias, and he's male.
Absolutely.
But I do think it's very important to both genders. It is at times that when you are excluded from certain services and aspects, as I was in my case financially, I think you just find this work even more important because it impacted you personally.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So Valeria, thank you very, very much indeed for that presentation.
Thank you.
Very, very interesting, and a lot of talking points there. And so there's still some comments and questions coming in, so we will make sure you get a copy of all of those. So Valeria, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now we're going to move on to Paul Laughlin, and Paul is currently Managing Director of Laughlin Consultancy and host of a podcast called Customer Insight Leader, and he works with leaders and their teams on the people side of data and analytics. He's previously held roles as head of customer analytics in different organisations such as Scottish Widows and the Lloyds Banking Group. Paul is a very, very good speaker. I've heard him speak a couple of times now, excellent speaker. And he is going to be talking this evening about developing the softer skills analysts need to make a difference in business. So Paul, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I'll try to live up to the billing. There's nothing like being overhyped as a speaker before you get started. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for that, Valeria. That was a great presentation. What I'd like to complement that with is talking about the softer skills that I found make a difference to analysts in their career. And I'll start off with what might be a controversial claim. It's going to be this, that far more predictive of the success of analysts in their careers is their softer skills than their technical skills. Let me just get into what I mean by that and see if I've got some evidence to stack it up. Okay, let's have a look at these slides. Hopefully everybody can see those okay.
Yep,
So I'm going to talk about how softer skills make a difference, how they help you be more impactful in the organisation where you work. A little bit of my backstory, as Matthew kindly said, I've worked across a whole range of different parts of Lloyds Banking Group over the years, careers in IT, actuarial and marketing, and along the way ended up creating and leading their data analytics and their customer insight side. 6.5 years ago, I got too old to do as I'm told, so I left and set up my own business to focus on, I guess, kind of putting my money where my mouth was, that I believed that the people side of data and analytics was really important and quite neglected in the support that's out there. So I work with a number of organizations to train teams and mentor leaders in that. And I do that because I find so much of the material that's out there at the moment is just more and more technical detail. You know, you could, even quite competent data scientists can be all at sea in trying to keep up to date with the range of algorithms, the potential of the new technology stack they're meant to consider. There is just literally so much. And that would be okay if getting better and better at those technical skills meant better experiences for customers, more profit for organizations. And yet, like many leaders, I can think back to times when I was at Lloyds and when I've been working with other clients as well, where you step back and you think, what's really made the most difference? What's really enabled us to be listened to by senior leaders in the organization and change how we do things? And time again, it doesn't take you back to those technical skills. Now, there's undoubtedly plenty of evidence. It's been growing over the years. This is a relatively old study now by McKinsey back in 2013. But there has been, I think now, a pretty robust case made that use of analytics, shown here in the blue bars, extensively in organizations, can impact the bottom line, can make a strong commercial difference compared with, here we've got light grey lines showing those organizations who didn't make extensive use of customer analytics. But when you drill into that a little further, what I found and what I find other leaders refer to as well is a principle of what I call relevance trumps sophistication. When you look at what drove that analytical resulting in profits or ROI return, it's often those pieces of work that were just incredibly timely. They were what a certain part of the organization needed at a certain time. They were rarely the most complex models. Often the most complex models make a small financial difference to the bottom line, but a relationship that understands what's needed and delivers it at the right time could have a huge and fundamental difference. But you wouldn't think so out there on social media, would you? Out there on social media, it's about technical skills, new software, new algorithms, new packages to be considering. There was a good piece of work done, I don't know whether anyone on this call has seen it, in the EU back in 2017 it finished, called the Edison Framework. It's a really well-produced competency framework for data scientists, useful, fills a gap of what's out there really in the literature at the moment. But what I found striking is despite all the different aspects of technical competency covered in that framework, it doesn't include the softer skills. It doesn't include those people skills that I was seeing were actually needed in day-to-day roles. Similar issue I find when I'm guest lecturing on an MSc in data science. There's a big danger that data science students leave university only aware of the priority of technical skills and with no preparation for the people skills they'll need. And yet, when I have the joy, a couple of other hats I wear, I'm a chief blogger on the Customer Insight Leader blog, and I get a number of leaders to appear as guest bloggers. This is a blog post written by Martin Squires, who was at Boots, now at Pets Home Group. And he, like many other leaders who've written on there, extols that analysts need to have people skills. It isn't just about all the technical prowess you've got in your toolbox, a range of people skills matter. And every leader, I think, who I've interviewed on the Customer Insight Leader podcast has referenced at some point during that conversation, people or softer skills that are needed. But what I also found, and I came across this when mentoring and coaching leaders, is there can be a desire to do something in this area, but no kind of framework to get your head around it. Everybody's got their own view of what softer or people skills are, and it can be one of those intangible challenges that's thrown out to analysts. So what I did when I had the opportunity to set up my own business was take some time to systemize the skills I was referring to, what I'd seen made a difference in practice. And that came up with this model. It's got 3 stages at the top level. There's skills related to contracting, ensuring you're doing the right work that's needed and you've managed expectations with regard to that. A range of technical stages that still need softer skills. And then the stages of delivering, bringing back what you've produced, what you've discovered to the organization in a way that's effective. First of those contracting stages is questioning. Don't just deliver what you've been asked for, question to get to what's really needed. The next is planning, whether it's from borrowed skills from the traditional world of project management, or we're talking about agile methods, whether Scrum or design sprints, whatever your flavor, how can you ensure repeatable, consistent delivery to timescales? And then buy-in, thinking about your stakeholder management. How can you ensure you really know who your key stakeholders are, you manage the relationship with them well, and you secure buy-in to the piece of work that you're doing before you start doing a whole heap of technical work and all that effort with the data. Talking of data, first the technical stages is that data work. Now, obviously there's lots of technical work required here, but it's also thinking about the people aspects. This is where it's quite a nice lead on from Valeria's presentation. This is where you should be thinking about, in the real world, how representative is this data? Am I introducing bias by my data selection? But also things like that GDPR concern. How do we think about provenance? Do we really understand the constraints or the quality of this data? And taking that kind of empathy for the real world situation you're trying to solve into your analysis. How to ensure you don't just get focused on hypothetical hypothesis testing or behavioral analytics, whatever approach you're taking, or even if you're building predictive models, but remember the problem you're trying to solve. How do you protect enough time for exploratory data analysis and really understand the context so you finish this work better able to answer all the questions and the challenges you may receive? And I recommend once you've done your analytical work, allowing at least some time for what I call insight generation. How can this not be a piece of work that's delivered in isolation, but how can you converge the sources of what else is known to get to a deeper understanding of why you're seeing the behavior you're seeing or why you're calling out what you are in the analysis? Then the first of the stages under delivering is sign off. How, when you've discovered something, you've got an insight or you've got some analysis to share with the organization, how can you avoid being politically naive? How can it understand the impact it's going to have on people in the organization, and in a careful way take it back into the organization in a way that's going to be supported? Leading into step 8, which is about visual storytelling. How can you use the skills of storytelling, narrative and data visualization to present back in a compelling way that people understand and they buy into? And step 9, bringing back to the organization a solution to what that need was. Getting focused not just on your technical piece of work, but what you're seeking to change in the real world. And ensuring you have the influencing skills around there and you have the feedback loops to learn from what actually happens in practice if your recommendations are acted upon. All supported by commercial awareness. It's kind of like a 10th step, but actually it's embedded in each of the others. You will do the questioning that's required, you will plan better, you will engage with stakeholders better if you have a higher level of commercial awareness. Understanding the finances of the organization, understanding the strategic decisions that have been taken, understanding the competitive market that you operate within. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is just give you a little bit of a preview into 4 of those jigsaw pieces. The first is questioning, we'll have a quick look at that. Then we'll look a little at buy-in and that stakeholder aspect, insight, and the visual story. It's going to be incredibly quick. Look, when I train on this, it's a whole day training course and I'm going to have 25 minutes. I'll try and constrain myself. So let me just give you a taster. First off, then questioning. What do I mean by this stage of not just doing what you're told, not just answering what you've been asked to answer, but questioning back? Well, the background to this is, I guess, a lot of years in projects and IT and that kind of side, where there's a diagram that's almost apocryphal now. It's this one. And it, in cartoon form, represents a classic problem that technology developments have wrestled with for donkey's years. Down the bottom right, you've got what the user actually wants, a tire swing. They've got a quite clear picture in their mind of what they want. They think they've communicated it clearly. But even with written requirements, everyone else involved can be divided by a common language. They carry around in their head a load of assumptions that mean people think different things are required. They go and operate in isolation. And guess what? Once again, we've got a project where what's delivered is seen as a bit of a disappointment. It isn't what people really wanted, or at least what they needed. And that's as true of data and analytics projects as it is of others. So if we're going to improve our questioning skills and really question back in order to not just be an order taker as an analyst, but really a partner in the business of delivering what's needed, why not go to a man who was so fantastic at questioning, they poisoned him for it because they got fed up with it? That's Socrates. Guy who, with a little help from Plato, systemized the approach to questioning to get to the truth that in some ways underpins our legal system. What I'm suggesting here is that you use a structured form of questioning when someone's coming with a request in order to get to what's needed. Use things like concept clarification questions. Is there jargon? If someone's coming and asking for data for another run of that successful campaign, or models so we can effectively segment again, what do they mean by model? What do they mean by campaign? What do they mean by the data extract? And probe the implied assumptions. Are there assumptions that if you just provide something to do the same again, they'll get the same result? Is that true? Are there assumptions that something that was done in the past was actually successful, or is what customers want? And then in the conversation, can you get into probing some of the evidence that's there for that? Would it stand up in court? Is there strong enough evidence that actually it's worth doing this piece of work, or is something else needed? And encourage your stakeholders to think of other viewpoints. A classic one I found in a lot of the work is often if you're getting requests from a marketing department, asking them to think what finance might say about this can help bring a slightly different perspective. And at the very least, probe the implications. If a stakeholder can't express what they're going to do as a result of the analysis, I'd go as far as to say you shouldn't be doing it. Analysts and data scientists and operational researchers' time is too precious to be wasted on vanity projects. You need to get to clarity as to what's the action to be taken, because that at the end of the day is the goal. The technical work is a conduit to get there. Okay, that's your preview. That's my soapbox on step 1. Let's jump forward to jigsaw piece 3. It's the piece around buy-in. What do I mean by that, about getting buy-in from stakeholders? Well, the first thing I encourage when I do training on this is to have a stakeholder map. Sometimes a bit of a long in the tooth tool, but then I'm old, so I don't mind. But I find it's much more common among people who worked again on the IT or the project side. much less used by data analysts, even for their BAU work where repeatedly they're serving certain portions of their business community. But it can be incredibly helpful in ensuring you intentionally manage the relationships with people who are going to be influential in getting the results you want. So I suggest a twofold approach to this, or really 3 steps. First off, do some 360-degree mind mapping. Think about who's going to be interested, who's going to be influential in whether what I'm trying to do here actually drives change. Well, probably my boss, maybe my boss's boss, maybe some of their peers are going to matter, people who might work for me, they're going to make a difference. There are other peers of mine who would need their help to deploy this. There are other people who do bits of sign-off and gatekeeping. There's other peers of my team. And there's a whole host of people when you begin to think it through. You can really go quite wide. And most people that go through this exercise, as they begin to think about it, there are more stakeholders than they've thought about who are impacted by their work or who can make a difference to whether it's acted upon. So what's needed then is a way of prioritizing, because you can't possibly intentionally manage that many people. You come to the classic 2x2 grid. How can you consider how influential and how interested someone is? So the vertical axis here is to do with influence. How much of a difference will it make to whether your analysis gets acted upon the view of that person? Are they, it's not just to do with seniority in the organization. Are they influential in managing to get action taken or a decision made? And then interest is really about engagement, because someone might be positive or very negative, but the low interest is apathy. They're just not interested. And what you're seeking to identify are the people in the orange there called the key players. How, when you put these 2 tools together and map everyone from your mind mapping onto that 2x2, how can you identify the people you should focus your time on? The people you quite possibly want to have one-to-one calls with, you want to protect time to intentionally manage them because they're going to make a big difference and they are actually interested. And then consider the blue. Maybe some of those people ought to be engaged. You ought to present it in a way that draws them in because they can make a big difference. The next thing I'd suggest is go beyond a stakeholder map and think about how you might need to flex your style for different ones of those key players. People aren't the same. Different senior stakeholders in your organization will have different styles. They will want to be kept up to date with different frequencies and possibly communicated in a different way. Now, most of us are familiar in business life with a whole range of psychometric segmentations. One could go Myers-Briggs, Bell-Bin team roles, etc. But funnily enough, if you're going to have an effective stakeholder relationship with someone, presenting them with a survey to fill in at the beginning isn't a great way to start. In fact, telling them you intend to intentionally manage them as a stakeholder might be a bit iffy as well. You really need something that helps you just observe people and learn about the style that works for them. And you only want to really understand them in a work context. You're not seeking to diagnose or psychologically understand the whole person. So unusually for me, there's actually a tool from a leading management consultant that I found is really helpful. It's the business chemistry segmentation produced by Deloitte. It's focused on work and you can diagnose people just observationally. And they've got some really useful tools that they publish for free there that you can use in order to identify whether some of your key stakeholders are pioneers, are drivers, are integrators, or are guardians. And if they are different ones, it can be incredibly helpful for you to communicate with them and seek to influence them in different ways. Different strokes for different folks. Further guidance on this is available on my blog, customerinsightleader.com. There's one post on stakeholder mapping and another on stakeholder segmentation with some rather fun videos. Okay, that's it for step 3. Just to give you this flavor, let's whiz around the circle and talk about step 6. So at this stage, you've completed your technical work. And I'm asking you to pause and think, before you go and present that standalone piece of analysis, can you go a little further and think about why you're seeing what you're seeing and start to engage with the mindsets and the attitudes that might actually change behavior? In many ways, I'm talking about triangulation of evidence here, but I'm going to ask you to think about 4 quadrants actually, rather than 3 points of a triangle. In the green on this picture is everything that's probably come out of your analysis. You've got a strong behavioral understanding. It might be behavioral analytics, it might be a predictive model, whatever you've produced, it's given you an understanding of behavior probably. What can you learn by converging that with the context of what you can learn from your market intel, the market and competitor, potentially some of the BI within the organization as well, so that you see that what you're seeing as behavior might be influenced by what other competitors are doing and the performance of your organization. What can you gain by converging it with, in pink there, the market research? Not as popular to talk about these days, but qualitative and quantitative market research can be incredibly powerful. Yes, there's behavioral economics biases to be aware of, but you still want to care about people's perceptions, their worldviews, their attitudes. What can that tell you about why you might be seeing some of what you're seeing? And I also encourage the purple quadrant there. It's getting up off your seat, basically, and going finding out what it's really like for customers, building that emotional connection. Do you analysts have an opportunity to go and listen into calls, to see customers in the context of which you're helping them with a particular job, to understand what it's like to use the mobile or the web app? Getting that kind of empathy can really help in improving interpretation, improving an understanding of the real world that they're modeling. And then I also recommend using insight generation workshops. This is where you bring together people from across the silos of the business, and they work together on bridging the gap between the behavior that is existing at the moment, maybe lots of customers are cancelling and leaving, the behavior you'd like to see in future, probably customers with longer term relationships with you, more loyalty as we like to pretend we can get, and the why as to why you might be having the current behavior. What do you know from all those different converged sources that can help you produce a good theory as to why are customers behaving as they are? What can you suggest as to the attitudes, the mindsets people would need to have to act in the way you'd like? And can you together work through some structured questioning techniques to identify motivational bridge? Something that would need to change, something that would need to motivate a change, that would cause people to actually see you differently as an organization. You're not just benefiting by people being creatures of habit and assuming you'll see the same behavior in the future as you did in the past. Further information on insight generation workshops is also available on Customer Insight Leader blog if you'd like to look into that. It's all for free, that blog as well, don't worry. Okay, that was it for step 6. Let's move on to step 8, the last part of the puzzle I'd like to give you a bit of a taster on. And this is the very popular, I'm pleased to say, these days. I used to feel a bit like a voice in the wilderness, but data visualization and storytelling is all over social media these days, talked about a lot, and that's a good thing. We live in many ways in a golden age of data visualization. The first thing I'd encourage you to think about to get stronger on the softer skills around this area is having a clear workflow for this. How can you ensure that you are thinking about data visualization earlier in your workflow? And it's not like the analyst equivalent of testing for IT developers, that it kind of gets done at the end if there's time. Otherwise, it will just be a quick whatever I can throw together in Excel. Data visualization is probably the single most important aspect as to whether what you present will get acted upon. Certainly the presentation of it is going to be what people experience. They weren't there when you did the work. It's how you communicate it that influences much more whether people act on it. So have a clear workflow. Have a clear step where you formulate the brief, you get really clear early on what is needed in a data visualization. You work with the data, possibly to get it in the right format for a visualization. Data is rarely in the right format coming out of analysis for the visualization, because you want to think about a chart that will support the message you want to communicate. Use some editorial thinking to declutter, etc., and then develop your whole design solution, not just the charts, but the messaging and the structure around it. That workflow unashamedly borrowed from the brilliant book Data Visualization by Andy Kirk. Second edition's out now, well worth reading. So if we're going to think about that first step there, the part of getting a really clear brief for the data visualization early on, what should you be thinking about? We've talked about questioning. Well, it's important for your data viz also to think about who are the stakeholders who are going to be looking at, reading, consuming this information. Do you understand what they're concerned about, the types of people they are? Do you have real clarity as to the need that we talked about before, what they need to do, what they need to understand as a result of looking at your chart or listening to your presentation? And how are you going to communicate to them? Is this something that you're going to be presenting, probably online rather than face-to-face at the moment? Or is it something they'll consume by themselves, so it needs more supporting explanatory information? There's some great content on this in a book, Storytelling with Data. Many people have probably heard about. Cole Nussbaum and Laughlin wrote that classic a number of years ago now. And she recommends a few techniques that are really helpful at this stage. First one is the 3-minute story. can you find a way, once you've completed your analysis and you're thinking about how you're going to communicate it, to write down in a couple of paragraphs at most, some text that you can speak at a normal pace, not as fast as I'm going, in 3 minutes. And that communicates the whole of what you want to say. It's a really useful condensing exercise to get you back to the nugget of what's the main message here. And then when you've completed that, come up with a single big idea. If you had to write just one sentence and that was what you wanted people to be able to take away from what they've heard, what would that be? The other thing I think I found can be incredibly powerful is do low-tech storyboarding. Many of us are in danger of going straight from we want to rush out of the analysis into our visualization software, and then want to start working away in PowerPoint or Keynote, whatever your preferred tool is, and start producing those slides. You can get quite emotionally attached then to the content, and you don't have the same willingness to try something, restructure, throw it away. Taking a different approach, using low-tech things like the post-it notes you see here, but especially the really small ones you can buy where you write maybe just a heading for each slide on it, enables you to take the time to think more editorially, shuffle that content around, try restructuring it. Is that narrative clear? Does it make sense? It can be really helpful. And then do think about your chart types. This is a visualization of a piece of content I find quite useful. It's the graphic continuum produced by John Schwabish, who runs the PolicyViz blog and podcast. And it's an aid memoir. People take this away from my data viz training to get you to get out of the ruts. Are you always using line charts with temporal data? You're always falling down to bar or column charts. How could you try something different? How could you do a bit of test and learn to see what chart types might work for different stakeholders and engage them more than just seeing more of the same old, same old? But if you are engaging with using a different chart type, a few things to add. Scatter plots. Let me give a big call out to scatter plots. When I'm asking people on the course the different chart types they use, I only get a few hands, so I normally clap for using scatter plots. They are incredibly powerful, and the visualization of them can be much better than those who remember old days in Minitab, etc. One of the powers of scatter plots is that they play to the strengths in the human eye. They enable you very honestly to often put the entire data set there, particularly if you push it more to the background in light grey and show the data you want to focus on in context, and enable the human eye to see correlations and trends and clusters and outliers, etc., at least eyeballing them. And then when you begin to use size and colour as well, so you can add a couple more dimensions presented in a single slide, they can become really powerful at helping you tell that story, helping you draw your audience into what is the most important data here, what are you telling me about the difference? Using effective amounts of white space, some annotation at the point of the data can be really helpful as well. Another common problem people run into with their data visualization, though, is you might get things like your line charts become too cluttered. You see things like this with far too many overlapping data series, making it quite impossible to read. What do you do then? Is it just too much and I need to show less data? And what's, funnily enough, always puts me in mind is that there's a quote from Edward Tufte, who's a bit of a titan in the data viz world. He said, there's no such thing as information overload. There's only bad design. So when you're thinking, I'm just going to show less data, consider, is there a way to do the design differently? So a possible solution to this is to think of two possible approaches. One is, can you use color as a focus and a highlight? Here in this line chart, there are still a lot of lines, but most of the countries have been pushed to the background in thin light grey lines, and thicker coloured lines are used for the only data you want people to be drawn attention to, a helpful average, and then this comparison between the United States and South Korea. Another popular solution, beloved by Edward Tufte, is what's called small multiples. Can you have small, consistent charts with consistent axes, a consistent chart type, put side by side to play to the power of the human eye in scanning? For evolutionary reasons, we have a whole range of abilities to scan and compare incredibly quickly. That can be a very powerful way to simplify and still to put a lot of information in front of people at the same time. And don't underestimate the power of annotation. There are many, many great examples, particularly from the FT and the Economist, of where this is small multiples as well, but where you can use annotation by the chart and begin to think about things like use of color instead of a separate legend in order to highlight the categories you want people to pay attention to. It's well worth thinking about your annotation layer, something else you can add to an even quite simple chart type to make it much more explanatory. But beyond the charts, when you've got this stage of how am I going to communicate effectively the findings of my analysis or what my model delivers for this organization and so should be implemented, let me suggest a few other things to think about. Learn from tabloid journalists. Now, love them or loathe them, tabloid journalists are experts at what's called the hierarchy of communication. In tabloid newspapers, you will find an eye-catching, provocative, controversial, sometimes funny, depending on your sense of humour, short sentence that is just there to be eye-catching. Below that, you will find a single sentence that is the main takeaway they want you to take. Then you'll find the first paragraph summarises the entire article, and you drill down, and you're drawn down and down the pyramid to more detail because you're engaged by what's above. That is something to make use of when you're producing slides. How can you make sure that the valuable real estate of that top headline that you've got, whether or not you use subtitles or not, is eye-catching, is the main point you want people to take away, is not background or variable A compared with variable B. That is going to be quite likely for people who are used to culturally reading left to right, where the eye is intuitively drawn first. Use it to leave a key point, the most important point you need people to take away from that. And a useful test as to whether you've got a good narrative flow through your deck can be when you're pulling together an executive summary, try just listing all the headlines from all the other slides and then read them alone. Does that flow like an explanatory story that helps talk people through what you found, why it should matter to them, and what they should do as a result? Okay, that's it for the visual story, and that's it for the preview. I hope that was helpful to get you to think a little about those softer skills and how they might be relevant to you. Different aspects that you maybe don't focus on as much as your technical prowess are worth the focus, are worth developing skills in. Now, I spend some of my time training, so I've got the in the genes, I suppose, as a trainer, that I don't want to lose the opportunity for learning. So one of the most predictive things of whether people get value out of hearing the kind of presentations that you've heard this evening is whether you do anything differently behaviourally in the next 2 weeks. So I would encourage everyone in this call, out of all you've heard from me and from Valeria, is there just one thing you're going to do differently in the next 2 weeks? If so, write it down. Hold yourself accountable to take that action within the next 2 weeks, and that will help embed your learning from what I think have been 2 great presentations by 2 brilliant presenters. Okay, then my contact details, they'll be on the slides when they're sent out. Feel free to get in touch. I hope some of the content I've shared here on a share online is of help to you. Happy to now take any questions that Matthew's got for me.
Thank you very much, Paul. And as Paul put at the end of his presentation there, he will make his slides available. And Valeria has kindly in the chat put a link to her presentation as well. We will ideally make the recording available as well, but obviously what we'd like to do first is just check the quality of that and that the presenters are happy with that. So yes, a couple of questions for you, Paul. One interesting one I found. I'll just read the question out verbatim.
Okay.
And it's, in the earlier days of electronic data processing, quote, successful systems were rather like heart transplants in their effect, liberating others from drudgery. Have you seen this effect in your work, and how would you manage the consequent demand for system development?
Wow, what an unusual question. Interesting, isn't it? It's like the promise we've always had, and I'm old enough to remember that we should have been living the life of leisure by now. We were told donkeys years ago by futurologists that by now we'd all be lying back smoking the big cigars, and AI and machine learning would be running everything. In fact, I'm old enough to go back before the AI winter. I was working on AI before it went out of fashion, before it came back again. I guess what I would say is I think the bigger problem that we have is that it doesn't make so much difference in organizations as the kind of transformative, relieving people from drudgery, transforming the work that people do. Not because it's not technologically possible, but for many organizations, that kind of radical transformation, I suppose these days we'll often throw around the term digital transformation, is held back because there isn't effective communication in the language of that organization, or to the customers in the language of the customer in order to make the incremental changes that could make that kind of difference. So I don't think I'd say that I've seen many organizations be transformed into places where there's no more any drudgery. But I have seen organizations that by having softer skills and leadership skills have made people's lives a lot better, yeah.
Okay. Next question, which I'll the person asked for you, Paul, but I'd actually like Valeria to comment on it as well, which is, do we need more education in ethics? And in particular in ethical experimentation in humans. In other words, corporations and political parties experimenting on populations for religious, political, economic reasons. Cambridge Analytica being, an example of that. But I suppose the more general question would be, do we need more education in ethics? So Paul, perhaps you'd like to answer that first.
I'll go first and then hand over to the expert. I would say yes, absolutely. Funnily enough, there's an event called the Data Leaders Summit, which I have chaired a few times. And one of the panel events that gets people still staying behind at the end, even when there's drinks, is when you get onto topics like AI ethics or data ethics. I think it's becoming a crucial skill for anybody who works in this field, and a crucial skill actually for leaders in organizations to be able to engage with ethics. I think the Pandora's box is open. People's eyes are beginning to be open to the fact that if we don't intentionally act to protect against it, we will automate the prejudices and the biases of the past. And I think that things Facebook have done, things that have been done in elections, etc., I won't even mention Brexit, have brought to life people's concerns that they can be being manipulated. So yeah, I think indeed we should be educating ethics, because it isn't a separate topic really than data and analytics, because data and analytics is about using that information for the benefit of people.
Okay, thank you. Valeria, I don't know if you wanted to comment on the general question about education in ethics.
100%, and I think it comes from different dimensions. So you need to make sure you are educating not only the people who are doing the technical work, but also the people that work around them, because it's easier to detect what can go wrong later on, right? So you want to make sure that if you see something wrong happening because of Cambridge Analytica, or you're forecasting that, you can intervene earlier. You can also protest inside the office, right? We've seen that. I mean, Google employees have been saying, we don't want you to sell services to specific areas of government. We're not okay with that. So if you don't have that power of knowledge and that dedication, well, it's very hard that you'll be able to prevent negative effects of solutions you deployed.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think actually think about this as education in ethics is quite a good way to put it. I think back to, I think too many organizations made the mistake that GDPR got reduced down to a checkbox exercise. That wasn't the point. The point is to understand the ethical issues that it was raising, and how can you change the value relationship with your customers to one that you're comfortable with ethically as well. So yeah, well worth educating more.
Excellent. And you may not see it in the chat, but the person who posed the question has just said, bravo for your replies to both of you. So. A question from me, Paul, in terms of, I hate the term, but you keep hearing this term of citizen data scientist. So people more, I'll just use the general term of business people who think they are more competent in terms of dealing with data now. Now, obviously, those people have the business knowledge. Quite often the data scientists have the technical knowledge. And obviously, a lot of what you talk about is bridging that gap between the two. How much do you see the overlap between those two types of roles changing? Do you think it has changed over time? Or do you think you've still got the issue of technical people being very technically focused and business people being very business focused? Or do you think the overlap is becoming greater?
Wow, there's a lot in that question. Okay, let me try and unpick a few bits. And I'll sort of knock them off around my virtual way my brain's working on it. So the citizen data scientist, there's an awful lot of hype and there's a lot of danger there. It puts me back in mind of the many abortive attempts at self-service analytics, which people get very excited about until they actually have to start consistently thinking that way and working that way. And then the money's wasted because they'd rather someone did it for them. But maybe the biggest danger is, I think, leaders, particularly in organizations, can't afford these days not to be data literate, not to have decent numeracy, and actually not to have decent graphicacy, because they're going to have an awful lot of data presented to them in the form of data visualizations they need to be able to understand and critique. So I think that there is a core skill there. And I think there is a meeting of both, but I think the two separate roles are still valuable to understand as different. I think there's an overhype, and it's useful for technology companies, of saying that you can have citizen data scientists, citizen analysts, that everybody can do it. The democratization of data would be the worst buzzword of that, I guess. And I think though there can be a useful transparency and availability, for every skill that an organization has, it's useful to recognize where there's expertise, and it's useful to recognize where it's helpful to raise the understanding of everybody. It's why I also recommend that there is training of people outside the technical areas in a level of technical understanding. So yeah, I've emphasized today the softer skills for the data analytics community, data literacy and graphicacy skills being trained to the other community, the business people all around the organization, is equally worthwhile. But it's still useful to understand where expertise and professionalism lies, and where a level of common language is being established rather than real expertise.
Mm. Valeria, I don't know if you'd like to comment on that in terms of the business people getting more data savvy. Again, I hate the term data savvy, but to pick up some of the points which Paul raised there.
Yeah, I think we need a bit of both. So I've worked with different data scientists and also with different business people, and I've not always been a data scientist myself. So I've been on both sides. I think it's the best solution if we both merge, when the data scientist is empathetic and explains things in a way that that person knows that others will understand, so in a simplified manner, and also dedicates time to explain the most important concepts. On the other hand, I've seen a lot of people do short courses on data science, such as general sampling and things like that, and work as product owners. And they grasp all the different concepts much more easily, so that really helps. Therefore, having a bit of like an intersection between the two is, for me, like the best solution.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So I've got a question for both of you, which is putting you both a little bit on the spot. So I apologize in advance for that, but just a final question just to round off. And I really liked your point, Paul, at the end, in terms of you've heard two very, very good presentations, both coming from slightly different areas, which is absolutely fantastic. But you said you should do something differently in the next 2 weeks based on the two presentations you've heard this evening. So Paul, what do you think you're going to be doing differently in the next 2 weeks based on what you've heard?
I love it. I love it. I love it. I don't want to talk to the audience as if they're students, but you should always hold accountable to people speaking. So well done on you, whoever raised that question. Okay, I think actually the thing I'm probably going to take away is the conscience prompt of some of the stuff that I heard from Valeria. I think it's more important for me to ensure that I raise the need to be doing that kind of thinking in a few different pieces of training that I do. Now, I don't say I'm going to steal Valeria's slides, but they will help. But rather, I think build into a number of things where I train in other topics, a few more references to thinking about some of the ethical considerations. So she's given me good pause for thought. That'll be my one to do in the next 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Valeria?
I think what I really enjoyed from Paul's presentation was the part when he mentioned motivation. You know, there's nothing better when somebody's driven by the do. I've been so bad at work I was doing today that I need to fix. So I certainly need the motivation just to do it properly, and also motivated people that work around me, because it has this effect that you contagion to others. So certainly just bringing that enthusiasm.
Excellent. Well, Paul, Valeria, thank you both very much indeed for your presentations this evening. I just remind to everybody, Valeria has already put a link in the chat to her presentation with some additional supporting notes, and I do believe that Paul is going to make his slides available as well afterwards. So with the, those will be made available to everybody. So I say, final thank you very much to Paul and Valeria for their fascinating presentations. I think what I'm going to do is actually promise myself that I'm actually going to read through the presentations again, rather than just attending an event and saying that was very interesting. But what am I going to do differently? So with that, I would like to hand over to Eduardo from the Analytics Network Group, who's just going to finish off this evening's event.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matthew, and thanks so much, Valeria and Paul. Yeah, I'm just going to be closing this session with a few reminders of what is coming from the OR Society and also similar events that the one that we have today. So we really encourage everyone to visit the website of the OR Society. You can find here similar groups as the one that we have right now. Like not just focus on analytics, but there are groups that are specialized, for example, in simulation or operational research, or even there are groups that are specifically based in certain regions of the UK. So I really recommend to go there. And also you will find also different workshops and also different ways that also you can certify as an analytics professional. So yes, please visit theorsociety.com. And other events that are coming, of course, they're gonna be online. There is one tomorrow about women in OR, also with a speaker in there. There is also a careers day if you are looking for new opportunities in analytics or in OR. There is one coming really soon on the 17th of November. And finally, also really good, interesting happening this month, and will be of interest of this for this group. Will be the Black lecture. There is a talk about forecasting. So really interesting lecture. It's an annual lecture that is happening every year on the OR Society, and it also has really good speakers in there. So yes, please join. Please go to the website, and if you are interested to be one of our speakers, please also visit the website or just reply us in the email that you were registered, and that you will receive more further communications from us. If you are interested, please let us know. We are aiming to host these events every 1 to 2 months. So we have now the opportunity to have more events because it's less organization from our side to put all of this just online. So please contact us. And also if you go to the website, you can even register your email so you can be notified when the next events are happening. And yeah, I would like to thank everyone to come on and join this session. And I hope you enjoyed the 2 wonderful talks from Valeria and from Paul. We will be, as mentioned, we will be sharing further communications to the email that you register. And also thanks so much for Matthew for chairing the event and for making a really good panel discussion at the very end. And hope you enjoyed the event. I will leave the Zoom online right now if you want to contact directly. And I hope Valeria and Paul, you have some couple of minutes to have so many other questions. So if people want to take any further contacts, so yes, I will leave it there. I won't close it. I will just mute myself and I will stop the recording and the video. But yeah, thanks so much for everything, and thanks so much, Valeria, Paul, and Matthew again, and hope to see you in the next coming events. Thank you.
Thanks, Eduardo.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Valeria.
Thanks.
I will leave it there. Thanks so much, guys.
Sorry, I was muted. So I posted a proper link there on the chat if people want it. You can get to the podcast from there as well. And I believe the slides are going to be emailed out to everybody. So if anyone's got any final questions, pop them in the chat. But otherwise, I think Valeria and I are going off for a beer or something.
Yes, thank you.
It's like waiting to see the headmaster, isn't it, Valeria? What have we done? What have we done wrong?
I think so. I cannot see any more questions. So
I'm not seeing any more come up. Oh, probably a big question. What is the best approach to approach data literacy within a marketing agency? Wow. Okay, it's a big one. Pose questions. Marketing people are quite creative. Find a way to start to gather people together and pose questions for them about what they understand by data. Something I find is actually surprisingly engaging is to get, there's a range of really great examples of awful data visualizations on dataviz.wtf and junk charts as well by Kaiser Fung, showing people some really awful charts and getting people to start to laugh about those and question what's wrong with them can begin to start a conversation in an engaging way that's kind of non-threatening within the organization. And then I think if once you begin to make light of things and make it a more humorous conversation, people are more willing to ask the questions. It depends the level you're talking about, but particularly with marketing directors at that kind of level of seniority, people don't want to lose face. That's the biggest barrier to data literacy, is people don't want to admit what they don't understand. People feel like they'll look foolish, and leaders never want to look foolish. So in whatever you're going to do, think of a way you can make it a conversation that people can join in with as a more fun event, rather than feel threatened about exposing what they don't understand. Or do it as an entire organization-wide program that you're just saying, look, we've all got to learn here, and you do it together. But that's more usefully on the whole led from the top, with the CEO going, I don't understand enough, come on, we're all going to do this. But those are my ideas for now anyway. Do you have any thoughts, Valeria, on data literacy?
Yeah.
Have you done anything on Monzo?
Yeah, so I was actually thinking about it, and there's actually a really good course, or like a course that is very simple on EDX. If you look for marketing analytics, that is also a way to start, where you just can follow whatever they're doing and just present it, or you can do like a rota where each person presents like a new week. So something we had at Lloyd's and we also have at Monzo is some sort of lunch and learn. A lot of what we would do is that we would pick a book or pick a course or something like that, and each week somebody new presents. In that way, there's that sort of like learning environment where everyone can participate.
Yeah, I really also, to compliment on that one, a really good book is called The Art of Statistics. It's just so really, really good from David Spielgater. It just basically, it meant to create data literacy, and especially I think it's quite a really easy read, regardless that it's a quite technical subject. So I wish I would have that one when I started my university, because that could have simplified so many things.
Sorry, Valeria, I put myself on mute. I was distracted by trying to answer. Someone was asking me a personal question on.
I'm trying to find also the course. So well,
okay, great. That'd be helpful.
Yes, that I think it was a specialization, so marketing analytics from Berkeley on EDX. So this is one of the 5 courses, I think, if that helps.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. You posted the link as well. That's great. Building on the book recommendations, actually kind of ties together, I guess, what we've covered today. If people haven't read How Charts Lie by Alberto Cairo, it's a really great, accessible to anybody book. So it's a great one for kind of giving to your non-specialist, non-technical colleagues or leader, that talks in many ways about the ethics, about how people have been deceived. Again, we could talk about Trump or Brexit or whatever you like, but we've had misleading statistics, often backed up by misleading charts, and that there's a need for everybody, but particularly leaders, to be more conscious of not being misled and being able to have a critical eye to look at charts. But it's written in such a compelling way. He's a journalist background anyway, Alberto. It's just a nice coffee table, small size book that would be well worth people reading to help get that conversation both about data literacy, graphicacy as he calls it, the skill to understand and critically assess and read well data visualizations or charts, and ethics. It's kind of a nice blend to finish with.
And I think my only final point as well is there's a very good course on Coursera called AI for Everyone. I think that's from Andrew Ng, which is meant in order to provide the essentials to people who work around AI or want to deploy it better and are not necessarily technical. So that could be potentially a way to get to know more about this area when you're not too familiar around it. And let me try to find it again.
Thank you. I'm just trying to quickly find out that the best way to be clear about the book is probably for me to put a link in as well. Hang on a sec.
Yes.
Okay, that's a book review on the book How Charts Lie. So that will remind people. Wow, that's quite a link from Coursera, isn't it?
Yes. I think I have clicked on a paid ad, so it just comes with a bunch of.
Yeah, that's fine. It's fine. It kind of speaks to the ethics of tracking in some ways. There's a tangible realization, the amount of tracking IDs there are in that link.
Yeah, everything that comes after everyone, you know, after that a question mark, that's all tracking.
So what about you, Eduardo? What are you going to do differently? You weren't put on the spot with the 2-week challenge.
Yeah, I think so. I feel it's from my side. It's just I feel I like the comment of from Valeria to take. We always evaluate models, predictive models using let's say a Gini, but it's just basically measuring how good you are classifying, but not how like not considering the not considering metrics of bias or discrimination. So I think on that side of try to create equal opportunities, that's a really good to use that one also as a metric when you are, especially in my industry that is offering loans. That's a good one to also include in as part of the models. And yeah, on the side on your presentation, I quite like the way of saying that you should put everything you're doing in a 3-minute story, because ultimately if you can structure it in that way of the what, who, and why, it makes you wake up every day and say, okay, I know what I'm doing, I know how I'm doing, I know why I'm doing it, and ultimately what will the impact of that. Yeah, I think that's a good one.
Nice one to finish on, Eduardo. Unless there's any immediate questions, I'm going to have to drop off and have my dinner.
Yeah, let's go out for dinner then. Thanks so much for Valeria and Paul. Yeah, let's keep in touch.
Matthew,
Thank you, guys.
for organizing. Thank you.
Yes.